When people think of important events of the Cold War, many would think of the Vietnam War, or the Korean War, or even the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, many would not mention or even know of the existence of perhaps one of the most important crises of the 20th century, and the Cold War. In late 1956, two imperial powers in an up-and-coming country invaded Egypt to reinvigorate their faltering empires. Instead, the crisis ended their empires and confirmed the establishment of the new Cold War balance of power. This was the Suez Crisis. For the past few hundred years, the powers of Western Europe were the undisputed hegemons of the world. During the 1800s and early 1900s, the British and French empires ruled the seas, land, and markets of most of the world. The empire on which the sun never sets is a term often described for the British Empire. However, after a century of Pax Britannia and 2 world wars, the sun finally began to set. The 20th century had drained their treasuries dry and flooded their colonies with new ideologies, the most devastating being nationalism. However, the fall was not sudden. Powers like Britain and France still tried to hold on to their former empires. Their efforts eventually led to the Suez Crisis. The crisis took place over the Suez Canal, one of the world's most important trade waterways. Opening in 1867, the Suez Canal was the first canal to link the Mediterranean with the Red Sea, which would in turn lead to the Indian Ocean. If the canal were to be blocked off, any country wishing to trade to Asia by sea would have to go around Africa instead of going right in between the continents. It was for this reason that the canal would be an object of most importance for the major trading powers of the world. In order to fully understand the Suez Crisis, it is important to explain who in fact controlled the canal. After its completion, the canal was operated by French shareholders and the government of Egypt. However, a financial crisis in 1875 forced the current Wali, or king, Ismail Pasha, to sell his shares to the British government. The Suez Canal became an integral part to the British Empire's economy. So much that it was one of the reasons why the British invaded and occupied Egypt in 1882 and continued their imperial rule into the 50s, which was enforced by 80,000 troops. The dawn of the Cold War would see a major shift in the status quo of these empires. Egyptian dissatisfaction with being a British client state rose until 1952, when Muhammad Naguib led a coup that overthrew the pro-British monarchy. Although Naguib would become the first president, his successor Jamal Abdel Nasser would be one of the key figures in the crisis. Nasser would come to symbolize and be a major proponent of Arab nationalism, much to the distress of the West. Nasser's goal was to modernize and empower Egypt, making it independent of any power bloc. His second goal was to institute Pan-Arabism and unite all the Arabs in the Middle East. Firstly, he would negotiate the withdrawal of 80,000 British troops from Egypt in return for the cessation of violence against the British. To help modernize Egypt, Nasser wanted to build a dam in the Nile called the Aswan Dam. Nasser requested financial aid from both the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as Britain. However, both Britain and the United States withdrew their financial aid due to Nasser's continued purchase of Soviet weapons. Both outraged and disappointed, Nasser decided to nationalize the canal in order to generate revenue for the dam. At hearing this news, Britain set out to reverse this change, once and for all. All nations affected by the nationalization tried to diplomatically negotiate the return of the canal to international hands, to no avail. As a result, the nations of Britain, France, and Israel began to plan their invasion during the next few months. It was concluded that the Israelis would be the first to attack, invading the Sinai Peninsula. Afterwards, the British and the French would parachute in under the pretext of keeping the peace between the two sides, which happened to be the Suez Canal. In reality, their objectives were to take the canal for themselves and remove Nasser from power. On October 29th, the Israelis began their invasion. The following day, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden made the following speech.
2 days ago came the entry of Israeli troops into Egypt. Was that a dangerous situation? Was it likely to lead to a widespread flare-up in the Middle East? In the judgment of the government, it was. Was it likely to endanger widespread British and international interests? It was. Well, It's possible to go on arguing who was the aggressor. Was it Israel because she crossed the frontier? Or was it Egypt for what she'd done before? But that's not the real issue for us. If you'll see afar, the first question isn't how it started, but how to put it out. The hard and inescapable fact was that here was a situation likely to inflame the whole Middle East with all that this would mean. That, in the government's view, was the fact of the situation, the grim, hard fact, the reality, which no words could alter.
On November 6th, Britain and France commenced the land invasion of Egypt. All three sides made remarkable progress. It looked like that Egypt would be under British control once again. The invasion caught the attention of the two superpowers. The United States was furious that the tri-party aggressors did not inform them of their plans, and were worried that the invasion would push Egypt into the hands of the communists. As such, they threatened economic sanctions against the leader of these forces, Britain, who was nearly bankrupt at this time. The USSR, who was eager to gain a new ally in the Middle East, threatened nuclear war if the three nations did not withdraw. On November 7th, Britain and France declared a ceasefire. Since the crisis began on October 30th, the United Nations had been working behind the scenes to establish a peaceful solution. Spearheading these efforts was Canadian Secretary of State for External Affairs, Lester B. Pearson. Pearson recommended the formation and deployment of a peacekeeping force to act as a barrier between the two warring sides. The next day, the first deployment of the United Nations peacekeepers are deployed under the command of the Canadian General Edson Louis Millard Burns. It would not be until 1957 when Israel officially withdrew from the conflict, thus ending the crisis. The Suez Crisis was a clear confirmation of the status quo imposed by the Cold War. It showed that Britain and France could no longer support their sphere of influence that they had gained during their golden age of imperialism. Both countries would be subordinate to the United States in the area of foreign affairs for the remainder of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union would replace the European powers as the major actors in the Middle East. The crisis pushed Egypt to become one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, symbolizing the struggle of many countries to remain independent of all superpowers. And finally, the crisis demonstrated the role of middle powers such as Canada, who would help defuse crises and conflicts that were detrimental to their respective alliances and to the world. This was the significance of the Suez Crisis. Eye patch.